to another series with the Speakers Forum. My name is Chase Anselmo. I'm a biograd here at LSU, and today we are hosting Dr. Gabriella Gonzalez, who is a physics professor here at LSU. Dr. Gonzalez has tons of experience with science outreach. She primarily works with LIGO, the Laser Interferometer Gravitational Wave Observatory, and they house one of the world's most sophisticated scientific instruments. They measure basically ripples in space-time called gravitational waves to prove Einstein's theory of relativity correct. And the science behind what she does is amazing, but today we're here to learn more about Dr. Gonzalez herself. She has served on dozens of physics committees. She has mentored tons of students herself, and she's won many awards, like the prestigious 2019 SEC Professor of the Year Award. And today I'd like to hear more about herself and her scientific outreach, which she spends a lot of time doing. So thank you, Dr. Gonzalez, for coming. First, I'd like to start with your career path and kind of talk about where you were born, what your major steps were to reach where you are today, and what are some of your main responsibilities today.
Well, first, let me thank you for inviting me here. It's great to talk. And if you get me talking about black holes and gravitational waves, I spend a lot of time, so I don't often talk about myself, but I try. So I was born in Argentina, and I would say how many years ago, but several decades ago. I was born and grew up in the same city. I went to college in that city. That's a city of Cordoba, a big city in Argentina, one of the biggest cities I've lived in. And in school, I already liked science. I was always good at math, but I learned to explain things. I loved explaining things. I loved chemistry and physics and atoms and how everything is made of atoms. Stars are made of atoms. So I wanted to go to college, not to be a scientist at the time. I was a bit naive, so I didn't think about a career path. I didn't think about how to earn a living, I have to say. But I wanted to learn to explain everything. So I went to college and studied physics because of that. And then in studying physics in college, I discovered that the professors were scientists, and not all the answers were known yet, but not all the questions had been asked, and I loved that. So then I said, well, I want to do that. And I met my husband when I was in college. He was doing his PhD, also in physics. We say that Einstein said that gravity should not be blamed for people falling in love. But we do, because we both were studying gravity and Einstein's theory, and that's how we met. And we moved to the US. He had a postdoctoral fellowship. I wanted to start my PhD. We moved to Syracuse, New York, which is a very snowy place. And we moved there in the middle of the winter. It was a complete shock.
Yeah, my mom's actually from Syracuse. So yeah, the weather up there is insane.
Yes, but for me, everything was different. The language, the culture, the city, the climate, everything. So it took me a year to get over that shock. But then I started my PhD. I started it in theoretical physics, but then I learned about this project LIGO that was just getting started. The idea had been proposed many years before, in the 70s and 80s, but this was the early 90s, and it was just beginning to get built, and I loved the idea of measuring, of building such technology to measure such tiny things that were coming from big black holes from out there in space. So that's what I did my PhD, and then I went, when I finished, I went to work with the LIGO group in MIT, with Ray Wise, Peter Solson was my PhD advisor in Syracuse, and Ray Wise was my postdoc mentor in MIT, and those are my two biggest mentors. I mean, I still keep in touch with both of them. And then I went as an assistant professor to Penn State, and in 2001, it's going to be 20 years this year that I came to LSU, because
congrats.
LIGO is very close to LSU. So I had been traveling to Baton Rouge a lot of times before I moved here, so I knew about the city, I knew about the university.
Yeah, and the observatory is only, I think, like a 45-minute drive from here.
Well, I drive fast, so
Okay, but still super close, yeah.
Yes.
So tell me more about your early life in Argentina. I mean, was it common for your friends, for example, to go to college? Did you have a lot of physics friends from your childhood, or, how did your family feel about you entering college and eventually moving to the US? What was that all like?
Well, my family always encouraged my brother and I, we are only two siblings, to study. They always said education is the most important. There was never any question that we were going to college, but they never forced us into anything. My mom they are both retired now, but my mom was a high school math teacher, and my dad was an accountant, so neither knew much about or were very interested in science in particular. But now they tell me, or much later, they told me that when I decided to study physics, they were a bit worried, thinking, what is she going to do with that? Mm-hmm. And then they said, now they are very proud, and they're very happy they didn't say anything.
Yeah.
But they were always very supportive. It was also a big shock to them. Well, not such a shock, but a very difficult decision when I moved away, because I had been living all my life very close to them. Mm. I had married only a year before, a few months before moving to the US. So all my life had been very close to them, and now I was moving thousands of miles away.
Yeah.
So it was difficult. It was very difficult, especially in the beginning, because as a graduate student, as a postdoc, we didn't have a lot of money. Actually, we had very little money. Mm. So going to Argentina was difficult. I only did that 2 years later, so I only saw them rarely in the beginning. Now I go, but not this past year, but before COVID, I go there twice a year, 2 or 3 times a year.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so you said your parents, maybe you found out later, were a little hesitant on you joining into physics. Was there any big, mountain that you crossed that they were like, oh, okay, now I understand, she's very invested in physics, or, she's, had a lot of success in physics and now we kind of understand. Was there kind of a before and after moment, or was it more of a gradual, just kind of over, a full career, now we kind of start to comprehend the decisions that she made?
I think it was gradual, yes. There wasn't a before and after. They did actually appreciate a lot of what I did long before the big discovery. We had a big discovery in 2015, mm-hmm. and I was one of the people who announced it in 2016. So of course at that time, they were very, very proud, because other people would begin recognizing me. But even before then, they were already very, very proud of me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So one of the reasons that you came to mind as someone we were interested in interviewing is because of your scientific outreach, like you just talked about. You were, the outreach coordinator for LIGO for many years. What motivates you towards being such a strong advocate for science, and not only the specific science that you do, but also just science as a whole to so many different levels of communities?
Well, I always liked teaching, and speaking about science is like teaching in a way in which you want people to understand. Sometimes teaching is, people think about teaching as lecturing, but lecturing to me doesn't mean caring about people understanding, receiving what you're saying. And I always thought that I always liked, even as a child, like playing teacher. That was always in me. And once I learned an explanation for anything, I just wanted to explain that to everybody. So that was my motivation. As you were saying, as leader of the collaboration, I was elected as leader of the LIGO scientific collaboration for 6 years. I was elected in 2011 and then served 3 terms. That is, the position is called spokesperson, but actually it's not the outreach coordinator, it's actually the scientific leader. But it's also the position where the people talk about the collaboration, often in different conferences, scientific conferences. But outreach is something that I like doing in public talks, going to high schools, going to middle schools, going to LIGO for an open house and showing how cool things we do.
Yeah.
That's what I like doing, and I think it's just an obligation we all have to give back, because I do what I love and I have the opportunity to get well paid for doing what I love, and science is done, most of the science we do is done with taxpayers' funds. I'm funded by the National Science Foundation, so we scientists need to explain why it's important to do what we do.
Yeah, and I think you'd be surprised just walking around campus how many people have actually heard you talk about your science. I mean, I talked about earlier how I've visited LIGO and you talked there. I mentioned to you before Justin in the blue shirt behind the cameras right now. He mentioned that you gave a talk at his residential college a few years ago, I think. And so many people I talked to, Dr. Gonzalez, oh yeah, I've heard her talk at this meeting or this place out in Baton Rouge or whatever, and I think that's really incredible.
Yeah, it's very easy for me to say yes when I'm invited to talk.
Cool. Okay. I was interested in hearing about any advice that you would give towards people who are interested in joining academia, STEM students. Do you have anything that you've learned through your career that you would tell these incoming students?
Yes, I think there is a very, very big misperception, especially about science, but in general, that you have to be really smart. And that's not true. That's an idealization. You have to work hard. You have to like what you do, because you are going to be working hard at that, and if you don't really like it, you're going to fail. So you have to work hard and like what you're doing. And you won't be the smartest person, because there are always very, very smart people, but you will succeed. Because succeeding, it's not being the best, it's being happy with what you do. So finding happiness in what you are doing, especially if it's what you do for a living, is, I think, the goal that everybody should aspire to. And I think a lot more often people aspire to be the best or the most famous or the most something. And I don't think it's about that. It's about loving what you do, enjoying what you do, and working hard to do it.
So would you give similar advice to yourself when you were joining into academia? Was there anything specific that you think you learned about yourself along the way that you would tell your kind of previous child self?
Yes, I think that I'm very passionate about what I do. But then I also think, and this is also a very common misperception, that if I don't do it, then it's not going to be done, it's going to fail. I've been in positions where I feel like leader of the collaboration or leading other working groups, and I think, oh, well, I have to do it, and I get so stressed if something goes wrong, or if when I don't do it to my standards. And then I realized that, like I said before, it really doesn't matter. I mean, I learned this when I had a big car accident in 2008, and I was about to travel to a meeting of the collaboration. I wasn't leading the collaboration at that time, but I was leading a group, and I said, oh, all the things that need to be done, and I'm not going to be there. And of course, the world keeps going around. The world doesn't need me or any one person. It needs teams of people. If something is very important, it cannot rely on just one person. And that means that one shouldn't get too stressed about something not going perfectly well, or sometimes failing to be at that place and thinking, oh, this is my career is over, my life is over because I missed this or because I can't go there. That's not true, and that's an advice. That's something that took me a while to learn.
That's really interesting. So one of the conversations I've had with my advisor, Dr. Maruska, who's also a woman in science, one of the questions I've asked her a few times now is, what is the transition like between, a grad student, a postdoc, and then moving into kind of leading your own lab, where instead of doing the hands-on bench work and writing all of the papers that have your first author names, you are now kind of leader of students who are doing all of their work underneath your leadership, and talking about that transition is something that I feel everyone kind of has to come to terms with and accept that you can't have your fingers on every single thing that happens, and you have to allow other people to kind of pick up for you.
That's right.
Yeah, I'm super glad you mentioned that. Okay, cool. So I think we're ready to move into the kind of second segment of this interview. Something that we're interested in talking about, a theme that we have, is women in science. And I was wondering, as a woman in science, what were your experiences like entering into academia in general, and physics, I guess, specifically? Maybe you can talk more about that. And how has being a woman in science shaped your kind of perspectives on the world, I guess, through your career so far?
Well, sometimes people get a bit disappointed with this answer, because I went into physics and I didn't think, oh, well, maybe I shouldn't because I'm a woman. Because I didn't know. That, like I said, I wasn't looking for a scientist career, or I hadn't been looking at scientists as role model. I just wanted to go and learn, and I did. I remember when I first entered, we were taking the introductory classes with physics, math, and astronomy measures. And there were many women, so I didn't feel that there were few of us. It was only later that I realized in Argentina, in college, that there were very few women professors. And I said, what is that? And they said, oh, they go and have children, they have families, they just don't do science. And I said, that's just crazy. Because the women professors, and there were few of them, but they had families. It's not like you have to leave one for the other. It was just very horrible misperception. Then I moved to the US, and in the US I was so shocked about the small number of women in physics, not just among professors, but among students. And it's still awfully small. I mean, among undergraduates, so in the US, there's only 20% of women receiving bachelor's degrees in physics. 20%. I mean, that's those in the sciences. The only other measures are engineering, computer science, and physics. All around 20%. All the other sciences have between 40 and 60%. But I didn't find any real obstacle. I heard both in Argentina and the US, people, especially senior professors, who said, oh, women cannot do physics. In front of me. I mean, they didn't say it to me, but they said it in front of me, talking in a group of people. And to me, it just made me lose respect for them. And it kind of challenged me. I said, I'm going to show them. But it's terrible that people at the time had such explicit biases. Those are implicit biases now, because we all grew up in that culture. So we still have those biases in there. And of course, it's because of that, or that's a big part of the reason why we have so few women in physics. It's terrible. Yeah. So certainly advocating for more, and I've seen, you've given talks about kind of calling for more women in physics almost, and pointing out these discrepancies. And I think now here in the US culture, and in general too, I think the problem is that, unlike me, when people go to college, they are thinking about careers. They are thinking about what to do. And if they don't see themselves represented in people in those careers, if they don't see represented among the teachers that they teach them, then they just don't think about this as a career. And in fact, what I find the most awful stereotype is that when people think about being a physicist, they imagine automatically themselves being old.
Yeah, because you always see pictures of old physicists.
Right, I mean, all in all, well, not all, actually, but you do your best physics when you're young. All Nobel Prizes did their best science. Einstein did his best science when he wasn't a professor, when he was in the patent office. That's when he did his best science. And so that's the first thing. People have to imagine young people. A scientist is a young person, and it's any gender, any culture. We speak lots of languages. we do all kinds of different things: theory, experiment, computation, lots of different things. And that's not what people think when they think about a physicist.
Yeah. Yeah, I too had that misconception, I guess. Yeah, I guess too, maybe I'll ask, do you have any ideas of like why maybe so many physicists do great work early in their career? Is it because you're able to hang on to your imagination better when you're just entering the field? I mean, do you have any ideas, anything to say?
Yes, it's because you are asking the freshest questions. When I give talks, the best questions I have are from the younger children, because they're not afraid. They're not afraid of asking questions. And they're not afraid of the question being silly or crazy. They don't care about what people think at that age. Now then, sadly, we don't keep that creativity going. But for us, for everybody, it's still in their 20s, in their 30s, when they are the most creative. Then, of course, you have experience, and then experience helps. But it helps in other ways. It helps to lead groups, it helps to build things, to build teams, but not so much to get that spark.
I see. Yeah, and kind of hang on to what makes you happy, right?
That's right.
Cool. Okay, so I was wondering if maybe you could talk a little bit about, just as a prominent figure and a professor, what are some of your responsibilities today like? I mean, what's your daily life like a little bit, as editor for, different places and,
Well, I've gone through several different stages in my career, and of course the last year has been nothing normal. So I won't take any day of the last year as a normal day. I'll go back. But I always liked a bit too much saying yes when people ask me for help. So I tend to overcommit myself. But my main responsibilities are training and mentoring young people. And that's what I consider teaching. I don't teach introductory physics to engineers for them to remember thermodynamic principles. I want them to be trying to think and to know how to read literature and how to ask themselves questions rather than use a formula sheet. And that's not trivial,
Yeah.
but that's what I try to do when I teach a course, when I work with graduate students, when I think about projects. So that's my main responsibility. Then, of course, my research is done in teams, so it is part of that. It's part of training, and as I said, it's mostly done by young people, so now I'm not the one with the brightest idea. So I show the ways, and then it's the graduate students, it's postdocs, the ones that come with the bright ideas, and then I help them develop those. but then I'm also participating, especially in the last several years, after I became a bit more known, in many different committees, advisory committees and boards. And these are things that I like very, very much. And they are not permanent. They all have terms. Like now I've been recently in the LSU Presidential Search Committee. Mm-hmm. So that's another thing I was asked to do, and I was already overcommitted, but I said, this is important and I want to do it, and I did. And those things are things that I don't enjoy as much. They are very interesting. I learn a lot, and that's nice because I learn new things. But they take a lot of time.
Got you. So you enjoy more of the mentorship role for your own students?
I do, yes, very much so. So a typical day, that's what you asked me. Sorry, I tend to wander
this is
away
great.
from questions. So a typical day in a normal period before COVID was while teaching, depending Tuesday and Thursdays, or Monday, Wednesday, and Fridays here at LSU. Then the other 2 days or the other 3 days going to LIGO to help diagnose the data, diagnose the noise in the instrument. That's my specialty. But then I also used to travel a lot. Travel for these board meetings, for these committees, to give talks at conferences, to give public talks. So I used to travel. I tried to limit my travel one trip per month, but I often ended up doing 2 or sometimes 3 trips per month.
Wow.
That was too much, but that was my normal life before COVID.
I think a lot of people outside of academia are surprised when they hear how social and collaborative science can be. Most of us are not little hermits and are little, just looking at numbers and data all day. We're actually talking to different scientists and hearing new ideas and finding sparks from young people and all these different things.
That's the other part of the stereotype. They don't know, when they think about a physicist, they don't only imagine an old person, but an old person in a white lab coat.
Yeah.
Even Einstein, I don't think Einstein ever used a lab coat.
Mm-hmm.
But that's a typical picture that you see.
Yeah. Okay, so as a, now that you've been in the US for a long time, you've been in academia for a long time, you've heard, hardships that women in science face. Could you talk maybe a little bit about some of these hardships and maybe some ideas that you have for solutions towards these problems? Like,
yes.
A lower number of females in physics, for example, or things like that.
Yes, it is all about changing the culture. And it's a culture not just in the academic world, but in the family world. It's still very common than in a marriage, and that has been made even more apparent with COVID. The household chores, the parenthood responsibilities take more time from the mother than from the father. And that, of course, is a big barrier. It's not a barrier impossible, but it is a barrier. So until there are equal responsibilities at home, I don't think there will be equal responsibilities and representation in academia. So the two things go together. But academia can, of course, help a lot with that. Like parental leave. Parental leave, and this happens in some Nordic countries, should be, in my opinion, should be mandatory. And it should be mandatory for men and women. And not to take a break, but really to delve into parenthood. And then we shouldn't expect people in their best years, in their 30s, or late 20s, to be moving from one place to another, which is now the common norm. We expect graduate students to devote 80 hours a week to studying and research. Of course, what time does that leave to start a family? Few people do it at the graduate student level. And then I'm married. I don't have children, but I did marry. I was married when I started graduate school. And then as a postdoc, you're not supposed to be more than 2 or 3 years in one place before moving to another, and getting a faculty position if you're in academia or going to work in industry at some other place. So when do you start a family?
Yeah.
It's crazy, and that's the culture of academia. That's what I think needs changing.
Yeah, I was also, I'm a pretty young graduate student. I've only been able to attend 2 conferences so far, but I was happy to see that in the first conference I ever went to, they were addressing some of the issues of, like daycare at these conferences, and how the expectation was that the female scientists coming in, if they came in with their partners or whoever, would take care of these children, and it would take their time away from the conference that they were attending. And so fortunately the conference, they were implementing these little daycares that you could kind of drop your kids off for a little bit and go and do your professional stuff. And that was kind of my first realization of where these expectations lie for women in science, and even I had to look at myself and be like, oh, I did have some of those expectations, and that is wrong. Like we should look for a balance in these things.
But again, that kind of things should be used both by men and women. Why if women are expected to take children to a conference, then why aren't men expected to do the same?
Yeah.
Children are children of both parents.
Yeah. Cool. Okay. So what advice would you have for balancing your work life? So more on kind of the personal level, I guess, rather than looking at the big picture of things. If you were to, talk one-on-one with someone, what advice would you give to them for balancing or finding time to build a family?
Yes, and it's not just to form a family; it's just to live. And I don't like this contrast between work and life, because work is part of life. Yeah. So I'd like to think it's work and leisure, or work and family. But it's not just family, right? It's not just family time. It's time for yourself. So there has to be a balance, and it's not just between its family, self, or leisure time and work. And sometimes these things go together, because sometimes I travel for a conference and that's work, but then I go to a museum in a new city I'm visiting, and that's leisure. So there are combinations of these things, but the balance is never perfect. It's not like, oh, I found the balance and now I'm set. It's always changing. You have to always be adapting, because the career is always changing, the responsibilities are changing, the family is changing. What we like to do changes from year to year. So one always has to be thinking about the balance, and one never gets it quite right, so one has to be thinking about it. And I've been very guilty of not having a good balance and then having to really reassess. Yeah,
that adaptability that's necessary in academia is something that I've personally been struggling with a lot. Bringing on all these new responsibilities and figuring out how to change. Once you find one thing, it might not work a year later.
That's right.
So would you say, would that kind of fall under one of your big personal struggles? Have you had any other big personal struggles through academia?
Well, yes, I think I told you about that car accident. That was several months of rehabilitation, and the support of my husband and my students. My students were the ones helping me to go to rehab and all of that. But also, at younger years, when I was a graduate student and my husband finished his fellowship, his postdoctoral fellowship, he got a postdoctoral fellowship in a different city. And then I finished my PhD and moved to MIT, and he was in Penn State as a professor. And so we spent 6 years. We had been married less than 3 years when we began living in different cities.
Oh, man.
And we spent 6 years living in different cities.
Wow.
And we found ways in the beginning. We were very far. He was living in Salt Lake City. I was living in Syracuse, so we could only commute by plane. Like I said, we didn't have a lot of money, so we didn't do that every weekend. We did it once every couple of months or so. And that was hard. Even the phone was expensive. But then he moved to Penn State, and I was still in Syracuse, so we would commute, and we saw each other almost every weekend. But then I moved to the Boston area. So at that time, and this is an anecdote that shows sometimes how creative you have to be. We bought a camper and we parked it in a very nice campground halfway, and then we both drove about 4 or 5 hours each to meet there almost every weekend.
Compromise. Yeah. Yeah, and it seems like that's a really common struggle in academia, in the US at least.
It is, but it comes because of this expectation that until you find a permanent position in academia or industry, you have to spend many years working 80 hours a week and moving from one place to another.
Yeah, I'm happy to see, I know at least in the biology department here at LSU, we've been having more and more of these spousal hires, I guess, where you have interest in one person and you realize, their partner is also a scientist in academia, and you say, do we have a position available for this? And you kind of make things work to give people opportunities to come together and build a family, for example.
Yeah, that was true for us. My husband, as I said, is a scientist too in physics, and he was a professor at Penn State when I was in MIT, and then I was hired as an assistant professor there too. So that's what ended those 6 years of living apart. And they were making an effort at Penn State, I think, because they really wanted my husband. So that's the other that's a funny thing that sometimes happens. A sad thing is that when one spouse is hired after the other, then one feels like, well, I don't know if they really wanted me.
Yeah.
So one has to struggle with that. But then when we came to LSU, they wanted us both. So that also made our life very, very happy.
Yeah, awesome. Okay, I think we are ready to move into our rapid fire section.
Yes.
So these are quick questions, maybe 20, 30-second answers. And are you ready?
I am.
Okay, so number one, who is your favorite non-academic historical figure?
It's a contemporaneous figure, Ruth Ginsburg, Justice Ruth Ginsburg.
Okay. Number two, who is your favorite scientist?
Well, of course, Marie Curie.
Okay, of course. Number three, your favorite author, fiction or nonfiction?
Gabriel Garcia Marquez. I've read all his novels.
What does he write?
He writes fiction. He's a Nobel Prize winner.
Oh, okay.
Literature Nobel Prize. Yes, he's a Latin American writer, very well known. 100 Years of Solitude is the most famous, but also the book I like the best.
Okay. Let's see. If you were ever elected president of the U.S., what was the first thing, or what is the first thing you would do?
Make education a lot more accessible. I think especially higher education here in the States is incredibly crazy. People having to get into debt for higher education seems criminal to me, because it's like, that's the future. I mean, this is a generation, and we want this generation to be the best educated to guarantee the future, our future.
Yeah. Okay, any sports that you enjoy watching or playing?
I don't play sports. I like driving my convertible, but
that
doesn't count as a sport.
That totally counts.
But I do watch soccer. I grew up watching soccer in Argentina,
of course.
But I also learned to love watching American football, college football.
Yeah, one of the great things about my lab personally is my advisor is really into soccer, and so over the summers when there's a World Cup, male or female, we make these little brackets and we have like a little competition of who's going to win. And that was my introduction to soccer, really as an American, and it was fantastic. I love watching it. I watch a ton of games now. Okay, let's see. LSU Tigers game in Death Valley or on your couch?
But I did go to New Orleans to see the championship game.
Oh, okay. I didn't even get to make that. Wow, I'm kind of jealous. Okay, one thing you can't leave your house without.
My insulin pump.
Oh,
I have diabetes, type 1 diabetes.
I had no idea. Wow. Okay, and chocolate or vanilla ice cream? Or another one if you have ideas.
Well, being diabetic, I have to be careful with ice cream.
Yeah.
But between chocolate and vanilla, I like vanilla with lots of fruit.
Ooh. Bone-in or boneless wings?
Well, they're a bit too messy to eat, but but I like them bone-in. There was a restaurant in Syracuse that was my favorite, one of my favorite restaurants called Dinosaur Barbecue. And they had the most famous wings.
Wow. And last but not least, what is your favorite spot on campus? Do you have any little spaces you like to go and relax or read or?
The quad, especially when azaleas are blooming. That's so beautiful.
Yeah. Yeah, and during most semesters you go out to the quad and you'll see people strung up hammocks and they'll just be out there relaxing. It's so nice.
That's when I take my pictures.
Yeah, okay. I guess that concludes the interview. So thank you so much, Dr. Gonzalez, for coming, telling us about yourself.
Thank you so much again for inviting me.